if you're solid axle swapping a GM truck and someone tells you that you should swap in a Ford Superduty axle instead of swapping in an MRAP axle or a Rockwell axle, they're wrong. Stay tuned. We're going to talk in this video about axle selection. Here at Tahoverlanding, we focus on GM full-size solid axle conversions. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to pertain to GM's full-size solid axle conversions, but lots of it is still going to apply to everything across the board. So just keep that in mind. And what you're going to find when you're doing a solid axle conversion, or even driving something with a solid axle, is nowadays you are told that you have to run a 2005 and newer Ford Super Duty 1-ton axle up front. You have to. It's stupid not to. It's the best option. Well, let's talk about that. So let's first go back 20 years. So I actually joined the off-road industry in 2002, like July of 2002. So I've been doing this for like 21 years. And after I was in the industry a few years, it was time to solid axle swap, a vehicle. I was willing and ready to do that, and I solid axle swapped my first vehicle. We didn't have Facebook, we didn't have Instagram, we didn't have YouTube. We had forums, message boards. It was a whole kind of different thing. And back then, I was told that I had to do 1-ton axles. And I was like, why do I want to do 1-ton axles? Why? I'm literally with independent suspension right now and haven't even broken that to smithereens yet. So why would I need to spend the extra money for 1-ton axles? Why would I need to go out of my way for the expense and also just the difficulty? And I'll tell you, I was young and I was broke. And actually the shop that I was working for when I was starting to undertake this went out of business right after I started the project. So I was actually in between jobs for a little bit too. So that's what kind of forced me to do the project. So I was financially motivated at the time. And I ended up going with Dana 44 in the front of my solid axle conversion. And what I can tell you is that I have the luxury of looking back, 18 years now, 17 years, I can look back and see, starting with a half-ton axle, was that a good move or a bad move? I off-road a lot. I've off-roaded all the trails anywhere near me. I am often a trail guide. I like taking people that have off-roaded around here to places and things they've never seen that are really amazing. 17 years later, looking back, I have never once had a strength failure of a Dana 44. I've never snapped an axle shaft on a Dana 44. I've never had teeth break off of a ring gear on a Dana 44. I will put an asterisk on that I've never owned a Jeep with the Jeep Dana 44. Those aren't real Dana 44s. They're basically Dana 30 outers with 1/4-inch thick axle tubes that are pretty thin and, a Dana 44 ring gear. I've always had a real 44 with the 1/2-inch thick axle tubes and the real outers. So, and, I've always had those. So I can tell you that if I had a Jeep one, I think I might have probably harmed one of those. And so whenever people are talking about a Dana 44, they are also often talking about Jeep Dana 44s that are found in the JK, even some of the TJs, WJs, some of the ZJs got Dana 44s. Those aren't even the same axle as what we're running. So if they have seen some kind of a failure, that's not even the same axle, man. Jeep JK axles and TJ axles, they have a 1/4-inch thick axle tube. That's half the thickness of these. And this is a 3-inch outside diameter axle tube. Those are a 2.5-inch axle tube diameter. So they are inherently weaker and prone to bending right there. The inner C's are the same inner C's as the Dana 30 uses. So that's why if you look up parts for a Jeep JK, they don't ask outer parts as far as brakes, knuckles, ball joints. It never asks you Rubicon or non-Rubicon because everything from the inner C of the axle out is the same as the Dana 30. So just keep that in mind, that those axles, if someone's talking about one of those, they're not talking about the same thing. They're basically talking about a Dana 30 with a big ring gear. But I have had no strength failures of a Dana 44. And I will throw in there one of the vehicles I had over the years happened to have, not a Dana 44, but a GM 10-bolt front, which is kind of based on the Dana 44. Now, I didn't wheel that one quite as heavily. It was just a K5 Blazer with like 35s on it that I lightly wheeled. But the point is that for my use, I never had the failure that everyone told me I was going to have. And looking back, I even remember looking at the available options because the Dana 60s of the time only had the same 30 spline axle shafts that a Dana 44 has. Keep in mind, this was pre-Superduty Dana 60. So keep in mind, they only had the small 30 spline axle shafts, and they were very expensive. And you've seen in this video here, where I put the bearings side by side from the outers of a manual hub Dana 60 and of the outers of the Dana 44 that we use in the Tahoverlanding axle swap, and of the Dana 44 manual hubs, the older ones. I put them all side by side so you can see what the bearings are used in those outers. And you can, surprisingly, the Dana 60 doesn't use as big of a bearings as you'd think. So go back and watch that video. I'll put a link in the description. But more importantly is it has to do with what my use was. Okay, I'm not a rock bouncer. I'm not going down and finding boulders that are 6 feet high and bouncing off of them and doing that crazy trailer queen rock crawling stuff. I'm doing long distance exploring, still pretty heavy off-roading, but not that heavy rock bouncer, 48-inch tall tire stuff. And I never wanted to do that. And so looking back, I'm grateful that I didn't fall in the trap of I have to run 1-ton axles. Because just keep in mind, off-roading existed before the 2005 Ford Superduty axle existed. People have been off-roading for decades and decades since the car came out. So if someone tells you you can't run an axle besides that, they don't know what they're talking about. And on that, if someone tells you you have to run a Ford Superduty axle, there's a couple of questions I want you to ask. Here's the first question you should ask them. Have you personally, not a friend, not something you saw online, you personally had a Dana 44 experience a strength failure? I deal with this discussion a lot as the one who's selling the Tahoverlanding axle swap and teaching it. And I can tell you, every single time the person criticizing and saying you've got to run a Ford Superduty axle has never had a Dana 44 strength failure themselves. They saw somebody else somewhere do it. Well, someone else is doing something different than what you're doing, I promise you. They use the gas pedal differently, they off-road in different places, they turn their steering wheel in a different way on the same trail. Like, there's no way to compare yourself to somebody else. There's just no way, I promise you that. So if someone ever tells you you have to run a Super Duty axle in your conversion, ask them, well, have you had a Dana 44 fail? And most of the time they say no. Now, in the rare occasions they say yes, turns out they had a Jeep Dana 44 fail. And I've already covered how the Jeep 44 isn't even a real Dana 44. So it's like, well, okay, so you still haven't had one of these fail. So you have no way of knowing what you're talking about. So then the second question is, well, if the Super Duty axle is so strong, and that's what's so important to you, why don't you have MRAP axles? What is that, mine-resistant, armor-plated, or anti-personnel? I gotta look at it. I'll put it on the screen, whatever it stands for. But they're supposed to be like explosion-proof axles that the military vehicles use, that pretty popular to put in the real hardcore rigs. Or before the MRAP axle, we had the Rockwell axles. Remember those? Why don't you have MRAP axles or Rockwell axles? And their answer will be this. Well, they're too big and heavy. They're too expensive. They don't cycle as much because they're just so big. The suspension won't cycle near as much. The wheel bolt pattern is completely different, so I would have to spend a lot of money changing wheels and changing the rear out to match that same bolt pattern. At which point, when they explain why they don't have MRAP axles, you look at them and go, that's the same reason we don't run the Ford Super Duty Dana 60. It's too heavy. It really is. The Ford Super Duty Dana 60 comes in at just shy of 700 pounds. I bought one recently. I did, to measure, and before I made this video, I bought one to have in my hands, because I haven't had one for a while, and take some measurements and everything else. It was like 700 pounds, but there was still like this much of the control arm still bolted on. So I bet you high 680s is what that axle weighed fully dressed with brake rotors and calipers. This is just under 300. Now, obviously weight means strength, fine. But if you don't need the strength, why do you need the weight? And the reason why that's important is look at the curb weight of one of these Tahoes. Take that curb weight and split it into 4 for just a rough per wheel weight distribution of one of these trucks. And then think to yourself, how much additional weight, what percentage additional weight is on the wheel and the wheel bearing at the wheel? This many percent extra weight on the wheel and strain on the wheel bearing. And that's all unsprung weight, which is undesirable. Unsprung weight is not what you want. So it's important to think about that. And I mean, there is, I guess, one benefit. A heavier axle does help a little bit with center of gravity. And we talk a lot about center of gravity here. So having that extra weight down low is better. And I know that you're looking at me going, how can you say this? You know, the big guys on YouTube like Matt's Off-Road Recovery and Dirt Lifestyle and Fab Rats, they run 1-ton axles. But really they don't. Matt's Off-Road Recovery started out with his Banana. And the Banana had crappy axles under it, so he did an axle conversion and put a real Dana 44 under it. And for years and hundreds, if not thousands, of off-road excursions in that vehicle, he ran a half-ton Dana 44. And it took years before he even swapped in chromoly axle shafts. You remember that? And then finally, after stepping up and leveling up even himself, finally went to 1-ton axles. After far more off-roading and improvement and leveling up than any of us have done. And of course, you know, he did build the Morvair straight with 1-ton axles, and then after that, the heavy wrecker. So what I'm saying is that even Matt's Off-Road Recovery started with swapping in a Dana 44. Okay, Dirt Lifestyle, Nate at Dirt Lifestyle, same thing. He has like his Jeep TJ and other things, like in this video here, he says.
Friend Andy 2 weeks ago, he just broke an OEM Dana 60 axle shaft. If you watch us on Trail to SEMA, Ben broke an 05 Superduty axle shaft that was stock, and he just had that 3.8 van motor in his JK and 40s. And then Chris Miller broke a 04 Dana 60 axle shaft on the same trail, OEM, and he was on 40s, all in the same size tire as me, but I had a chromoly set of axle shafts in a Dana 44.
Where he has 40-inch tires on a vehicle getting wheeled on the Rubicon Trail with a Dana 44 in the front. So he does the same thing also. Okay, Fab Rats, kind of connected with you know, Matt's Off-Road Recovery. Paul's, you know, Toyota Tacoma, what did he swap under the front of it? A Dana 44.
Truck all done, front end's all put together, the air's all installed on it. Everything seems to be happy, so we're gonna go flex it up a little bit and kick the blocker in, and we'll see if it works.
So I'm telling you that the guys that know what they're doing don't go straight for 1-ton axles. Never. So when someone tells you that you've got to go to a 1-ton axle first, they don't know what they're talking about. I will say there's one saving grace. Having a couple of extra 100 pounds down low is better. Okay, there is one redeeming factor, but it's extra strain on the wheel bearing. Now I have a friend here locally who went with the WFO Concepts kit to put a solid front axle under his Suburban. It uses the Ford Super Duty front axle. He did that swap 2 years ago. In the 2 years from the time he started until now, he has spent nearly $2,000 replacing wheel bearings. $2,000. And that is also because, you know, the hub assemblies are $500 a piece. Because just like I was talking about the wheel bolt pattern being wrong, the Ford Super Duty bolt pattern is an 8-lug bolt pattern, but it's a metric 8-lug bolt pattern. And this guy had a, you know, an 8-lug Suburban. So he still, though, had to spend $1,000 on adaptation hubs that have the 8 on 6.5 bolt pattern in it. That's what he did. And those hubs wore out because, you know, he's got, you know, 37-inch tires and he has a heavy axle. He wore out those hubs and had to replace them again. $500, $500, $500, $500, $2,000 in 2 years. Now, there's more than one way to deal with, you know, the difference in wheel bolt pattern on the Ford Super Duty Dana 60. So one option is people are using wheel adapters. They are buying wheel spacers that are 2 inches long, thick, that bolt onto the metric pattern and then space out and are drilled and threaded with studs to put the 8x6.5 bolt pattern for the Chevy wheels. Well, those cost a couple of $100 minimum, and that's an aluminum wheel spacer that big. If you are so hell-bent on strength that you're putting in the Ford Super Duty axle, you're throwing all that strength away putting those wheel spacers on, because many a wheel spacer has snapped off. So you get bored, Google that. So that is an option, but it basically flies in the face of going down the route of Ford Super Duty axle. So that's where I'm going, is that it's an extremely expensive route to go. Now also, the WFO Concepts solid axle kit for the Chevy has perfectly parallel radius arms. Now, I did in this video here, showed the actual flex increases that you get for triangulating your radius arms, tipping the rear mounting point inward so they are a little triangulated. You get a lot more flex. Parallel radius arms bind like crazy. Not to mention the Ford bushings on the Super Duty axle, they're super rigid. Oh my gosh, they don't flex at all. I'm working on a product to improve the WFO Concepts kit, and I've been working with the customer that has that kit with the Super Duty axle under his GMT 800 Suburban, and he's provided me some measurements. He has got such a tall center of gravity that, as you've seen in us measuring this video here, we measure from the center of the hub up to the fender lip, just to figure out, you know, how high the suspension is. Because if you go off of tires or from the ground, how tall your tires are, how much air is in your tires make a difference. But if you go from the center of the hub up to the fender lip, it's a solid number. If you look at how tall his truck is at ride height, plus how much travel he has upward from ride height before the suspension fully compresses, even if his suspension was fully bottomed out, his Suburban is higher off the ground than the Tahoverlanding axle swap gets you at ride height. Meaning, if he pulled his springs out and just slammed his truck down onto the ground, he's still got a higher center of gravity, as we start with at ride height. And we still have 4.5 inches of upward travel from there to go. So that's the kind of things I'm talking about with the Ford Super Duty axle. Going that route costs you all kinds of stuff. I made a video just like this about 1.5 years ago, and there were a lot of hurt feelings. And some of the guys that are Dana 60, Ford Super Duty Dana 60 fanboys lit me up pretty hard. And one guy who is one of the, the Peterson's Ultimate Adventure guys did comment. And what he commented, because he couldn't argue with all the other things I said, because he's actually a pretty smart guy. But he did comment that the Ford Super Duty axle, because of the big U-joints on the axle shafts, could get more total turning, turning degrees on the knuckle. And I had never verified that. And I hadn't had a Ford Super Duty axle in a long time. So I bought one. And I measured it. And what did I come up with? Okay, so this is at full steering lock. And I'm sure there's some better way of doing this, but we're going to measure it this way. So as you can see, this is parallel with the casting on the axle. We can assume that that's parallel. Okay. Exactly 30 degrees. Right on the line. 30 degrees. Okay. So now we got to measure this one. Okay. Full lock. Use the same tool. Now the way, since it's already got tires on it and everything, I'm just gonna put that against the brake rotor. gonna line it up. There. This is just a loose eyeball, by the way. I haven't even looked at it yet. Let's see what... Hey, 62 degrees, so it's probably 60. I measured 62 degrees. That's the same steering as a Ford Super Duty axle, so even that benefit is null and void. So then, okay, let's talk about some of the real legit guys. Nate from Dirt Lifestyle, he put a video out about a year and a half ago where he was talking about Ford Super Duty axle shafts compared to Dana 44 axle shafts that had been upgraded to chromoly. So he was comparing stock Super Duty axles to Dana 44 chromoly axles. And here's what he said.
I want to go on a little tangent about OEM axle shafts. I personally have broken a number of OEM axle shafts. I'm surrounded by people that break OEM axle shafts all the time. My friend Andy, 2 weeks ago, he just broke an OEM Dana 60 axle shaft. If you watch us on Trail of SEMA, Ben broke an 05 Super Duty axle shaft that was stock, and he just had that 3.8 van motor in his JK and 40s. And then Chris Miller broke a 04 Dana 60 axle shaft on the same trail, OEM, and he was on 40s, all in the same size tire as me, but I had a chromoly set of axle shafts in a Dana 44. So material type makes a really big difference in strength.
So Nate from Dirt Lifestyle, who I trust, he is far more legit than I will ever be, even showed that a Dana 44 with chromoly axle shafts is stronger than a Super Duty with stock axle shafts. So if you're considering a Ford Super Duty swap, and if your intention was to keep the axle shafts stock, then you're wasting your time. But see this axle right here? The Dana 44 we use in the Tahoverlanding axle swap? I told myself, once I snap an axle shaft, I'll put chromoly shafts in. We're 3.5 years later. I still haven't snapped an axle shaft. Still. Hasn't happened. So, I mean, if you're gonna tell me that it's better to put in a Super Duty axle, you're dead wrong in most cases. Now, and here's another reason for that is that if you have a GM full size with independent suspension, whatever you're using it for, I promise you, you don't need a Ford Super Duty axle. Everything you have done with your independent suspension GM truck is nowhere near the limit of a Ford Super Duty axle. And it's also nowhere near the limit of even this axle. So when I bought that Ford Super Duty axle, I also took some measurements. Measurements across here, and up here. It's so much bigger through here that you can't even make that axle tuck upward as far as this one will by several inches. Then you start throwing around how much lower it is through here. Okay, so first things first, 3 3/4 inch axle tubes. Set that. Top of the housing, you are 6 full inches to the top of the housing. Same thing, 6 3/4 to the bottom of the housing from axle center line. If you leave the factory radius arm mounts in place, you're 2.5 inches, sorry. If you leave the factory radius arm mounts in place, you're 4.5 inches up from axle center line to that part. And that's the same on this side or on the passenger side as well. Okay, so let's check the exact same measurements here on the Dana 44. Five 1/4 inches to the highest point. I'm just eyeballing this as level as I can to the axle tubes. 5 1/4 to the lowest point. Interesting. And you know what? That's underside clearance. You need bigger tires to clear that underside, and you've got to double whatever the difference is, because if you get a 2-inch tall tire, it's 1 inch taller on the bottom, 1 inch taller on the top. So I told you my friend who's on 37s with the Ford Super Duty axle on his Suburban, I'm on 35s with this axle. I have more underside clearance right here than he does. And here's one caveat to that. This Dana 44 is the only axle that if you install it first, and as you progress through your off-road and get more and more extreme and need a stronger axle, you can remove this axle, take it out, and put in its place the 1-ton Dodge Dana 60 axle, also the newer 1-ton Dodge AAM front axle, clear on up to the Magna axles that they put under the 5500 and 4500 Dodge heavy-duty trucks, because the control arm points and spring points and everything are all in the same spot. So you can upgrade in just an afternoon's worth of work to a even stronger axle than a Ford Super Duty if you need it. This is the only Dana 44 you can put in that has 4 upgraded in strength axles that fit in its place. 4. And therefore you can start, you can grow. If you decide that you're going to start getting real crazy, put a bigger axle in. And if you don't need it, you haven't wasted the time, the money, or cost yourself the performance. Because the Ford Super Duty axle being thicker across here and everything cannot tuck upward nearly as high, on the order of several inches, and cannot clear underside by nearly as much, almost 2 inches. Just keep that in mind, okay? That you're not getting the same exact axle as this that's just stronger. You're getting a whole boatload of trade-offs that is stronger. Thanks for watching.